What happens when an arrogant prosecutor tries to humiliate a black defendant, only to discover he's the state attorney general? Meet Thomas Whitaker, a prosecutor who thrives on intimidation and power plays. He thought today's case was just another routine takedown, until his so-called defendant dropped a bombshell that turned the entire courtroom upside down. How did this shocking twist expose the system's deep flaws? And when the truth came out, who really ended up humiliated? A courtroom battle, a career-shattering moment, and a lesson in justice no one saw coming. Stay tuned, because this is one legal showdown you don't want to miss. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so the community can grow and we can bring you more stories like this. Now, let's get into it. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, the air thick with anticipation. It was just another case for Assistant District Attorney Thomas Whitaker, a man known for his sharp tongue and even sharper ambition. Whitaker was the type who thrived on humiliation. He believed that putting a defendant in their place, especially when they didn't fit his idea of respectability, was an art form. Today, he had a special target, a black man sitting calmly at the defense table, his hands folded neatly, his expression unreadable. The name on the docket read David Langston. No priors, no criminal history. Charged with resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. Whitaker smirked as he glanced at the man in the tailored navy suit. To him, Langston was just another arrogant defendant who thought he was smarter than the system. That would change soon. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Ellen Pembroke entered, her stern gaze sweeping over the room. "Be seated," she instructed. Whitaker stood, buttoning his jacket as he took his position at the podium. "Your Honor, the state is ready to proceed." Judge Pembroke nodded. "Defense?" Langston remained seated, his deep brown eyes steady. Then, in a measured voice, he replied, "Ready, Your Honor." Whitaker chuckled under his breath. No defense attorney had shown up. This guy was representing himself. Amateur mistake. He stepped forward, pacing slightly as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you'll hear a story about a man who refused to follow simple lawful instructions. A man who disrespected law enforcement and then tried to play the victim." Langston showed no reaction. Whitaker continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "The evidence will show that Mr. Langston was approached by officers outside a high-profile event. When asked for identification, he refused. When officers attempted to detain him, he resisted. His behavior was not only unlawful, it was dangerous." He turned to the defendant. "Mr. Langston, let's get right to it. Can you tell the court what you do for a living?" A pause. Then Langston adjusted his cufflinks and said evenly, "I'm an attorney." Whitaker smirked. "Ah, an attorney. And where exactly did you get your law degree?" "Harvard." The room fell silent. A few jurors exchanged glances. Judge Pembroke's eyebrows lifted slightly. Whitaker's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Harvard, you say? Well, I suppose even the best institutions produce a few bad apples." Langston didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands. "Mr. Whitaker, do you typically insult members of your own legal community, or is today special?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Whitaker's jaw tightened. He cleared his throat. "Tell me, Mr. Langston, if you're such a high and mighty attorney, why couldn't you follow simple police instructions?" Langston leaned forward slightly. His next words made the entire courtroom go still. "Because I outrank them." Whitaker frowned. "Excuse me?" Langston exhaled, almost as if he was growing tired of the charade. Then, with the precision of a blade cutting through silk, he said, "I am the state attorney general." The room erupted. For a moment, Whitaker thought he had misheard. The words didn't make sense. State attorney general? That couldn't be right. Laughter from the gallery broke his trance. A few jurors looked at each other wide-eyed. Even Judge Pembroke straightened in her seat, the usual sternness in her expression replaced by intrigue. Whitaker forced out a dry chuckle. "You expect us to believe that?" Langston reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. He flipped it open and held it up for the judge. The gold lettering was unmistakable. Office of the Attorney General, State of Georgia. Judge Pembroke leaned forward, peering at the credentials. A beat of silence. Then, "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "it appears that Mr. Langston is, in fact, the State Attorney General." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman in glasses, mouthed, "Oh my God." Whitaker's face burned. This had to be a joke. This couldn't be happening. He started, but his throat went dry. He had built his entire case around humiliating this man, and now it was collapsing before his eyes. Langston leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself a small, knowing smile. "I was waiting for you to figure it out, Mr. Whitaker. I gave you plenty of chances." A vein pulsed in Whitaker's forehead. He gripped the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. This doesn't change the facts. Title or not, you resisted arrest. You refused to comply with police orders." Langston exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" He turned to Judge Pembroke. "With the court's permission, I'd like to correct a few details of the prosecution's narrative." Judge Pembroke hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Proceed." Langston stood, adjusting his jacket. When he spoke, his voice was smooth but firm, each word landing with precision. "On the evening in question, I was attending a judicial fundraising gala, a private event that required invitations for entry. I had just stepped outside to take a call when 2 officers approached and demanded to see my identification." He turned slightly, facing the jury. Now that in itself wasn't an issue. What was an issue, however, was how they approached me. No probable cause, no explanation, just immediate suspicion because he gestured toward himself, was standing outside a high-profile venue in an expensive suit, and I didn't look the part. A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. One officer demanded my ID in a tone that suggested he didn't expect me to have one. The moment I reached for my wallet, the second officer grabbed my arm, without cause, and attempted to force me against a wall. That's when I pulled back and demanded to know their reasonable suspicion. He let that sink in before continuing. I didn't resist arrest. I resisted unlawful detainment. Whitaker felt his stomach drop. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the difference. The jury hung on to his every word. He forced a smirk. "So, let me get this straight," he said, voice laced with mock disbelief. "You were standing outside a private event. 2 officers approached you and you, being the State Attorney General, decided to escalate the situation rather than simply comply." Langston tilted his head slightly, almost as if he were studying Whitaker under a microscope. "You call it escalation. I call it defending my rights." Whitaker scoffed. "Your rights? You were uncooperative with law enforcement." Langston exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "And there it is," he said almost to himself. Then, locking eyes with Whitaker, he continued, "That word, uncooperative, is used far too often as a blanket excuse to justify unlawful actions against black men and women." A few members of the jury sat up straighter. "I asked the officers what law I was breaking," Langston continued, his voice calm but charged with an undeniable authority. "I asked why I was being treated like a suspect outside a venue where I was an invited guest. And do you know what they told me?" He paused. The courtroom was so quiet that even the faint hum of the air conditioning was audible. Nothing, because they had no answer. Whitaker opened his mouth, but Langston wasn't finished. Instead of responding, they tried to force me into compliance, not because I was breaking the law, but because I had the audacity to demand that they follow it. Judge Pembroke cleared her throat. "Mr. Langston, did you, at any point, identify yourself as the Attorney General?" Langston nodded. After the second officer grabbed my arm, I told them exactly who I was. I even offered my credentials. Another pause. Whitaker's stomach tightened. Langston turned back to the jury. And do you know what happened next? The entire courtroom waited. They slammed me against the hood of a squad car and handcuffed me. A collective gasp. Whitaker's pulse pounded. This is bad. I didn't resist, Langston continued. I didn't fight back. And yet, I was treated as though I had already been found guilty of something, despite committing no crime. Whitaker knew he had to regain control. He stepped forward, forcing an incredulous laugh. So, let me get this straight. You, a man with extensive legal training, didn't think that refusing to comply with police orders would escalate the situation? Langston's expression darkened. No, Mr. Whitaker. I didn't think being a black man outside an upscale venue would be considered suspicious in the first place. A sharp silence. For the first time since the trial started, Whitaker felt truly exposed. Because he wasn't just losing this case, he was losing the room. Whitaker could feel the jury turning against him. Their expressions had shifted, some skeptical, some troubled, others downright uncomfortable. The air in the room was different now. He needed to reframe the situation. Steeling himself, he adjusted his tie and forced a chuckle. Mr. Langston, with all due respect, you're an experienced attorney. You understand how high-pressure situations work. Officers have to make split-second decisions for their own safety. Surely, you can admit that your refusal to comply made their jobs harder? Langston's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Whitaker, are you suggesting that law enforcement's job is to profile citizens rather than uphold the law? Whitaker's smirk faltered. That's not what I said. Isn't it? Langston countered, stepping away from the defense table. Let's go back to your argument. You claim I refused to comply. He made air quotes with his fingers. Let me clarify something for you. I did comply. I gave them my name. I told them I was an invited guest at the event. I informed them that I was the Attorney General. He turned slightly, addressing the jury directly now. And what did they do? They ignored every word I said because they had already decided I was a criminal before I even opened my mouth. A few jurors nodded slightly. Whitaker's throat tightened. Langston kept going, his voice steady but unyielding. You keep using the word uncooperative, but let's be clear. What they wanted was submission. Blind, unquestioning submission. Not from a suspect, from a citizen, from a man with no criminal record, from the highest legal authority in this state. His words landed like thunderclaps in the silent courtroom. Judge Pembroke tapped her gavel lightly. Mr. Langston, I understand your frustration, but let's keep this focused on the facts. Langston inclined his head. Of course, Your Honor. The facts are these. I was detained unlawfully. I was cuffed and publicly humiliated. My civil rights were violated. And now, Mr. Whitaker is standing here, attempting to paint me as a man who refused to comply, when the only thing I refused to do was accept injustice. Whitaker could feel the sweat forming at his temples. His case was crumbling. He glanced at Judge Pembroke, hoping for some kind of intervention, but she was simply watching, waiting. Langston took a step closer to the prosecution's table, lowering his voice just enough to make the room lean in. And tell me, Mr. Whitaker, he said, with something almost resembling pity in his tone, if this is how the system treats the Attorney General of the state, how do you think it treats the average black man? Whitaker had no answer. The courtroom did. The silence spoke for itself. The weight of Langston's question settled over the room like a thick fog. No one spoke. No one moved. The jury, the spectators, everyone was processing. Whitaker, however, was unraveling. He gripped the edge of his podium, his mind racing. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He had walked into this case expecting an easy win, a routine prosecution. Instead, he had unknowingly gone head-to-head with the top law enforcement official in the state. And worse, he had humiliated himself in the process. But he wasn't finished yet. Not if he could help it. Clearing his throat, Whitaker straightened. "That's quite the speech, Mr. Langston," he said, forcing an air of confidence. "But let's return to the actual matter at hand. Regardless of how you felt about the officer's approach, you still resisted their attempt to detain you." Langston sighed, shaking his head. "You keep twisting the narrative, Mr. Whitaker, but let's test your logic." He turned to Judge Pembroke. "Your Honor, may I pose a direct question to the prosecution?" Judge Pembroke hesitated, but nodded. "Proceed." Langston locked eyes with Whitaker. "Tell me, Mr. Whitaker, if you were standing outside a private event, dressed in a suit, minding your business, and two officers approached you without cause, demanded identification, and ignored your legal rights, would you immediately submit?" Whitaker clenched his jaw. "That's not the same." "It's exactly the same," Langston interrupted. "And we both know that if you had been in my position, you wouldn't have been slammed against a car and cuffed in front of a crowd." A murmur rippled through the jury. Langston took another step forward. "This isn't just about me. It's about a pattern. A system where a black man's presence in certain spaces is automatically met with suspicion. A system that assumes guilt first, proof later." His voice didn't waver. "And instead of acknowledging the real problem, you stand here and try to convince this court that I am the one at fault for questioning injustice?" Whitaker had no comeback. He could see the shift happening. The jury, the judge, even some of the court officers were no longer on his side. The confidence he had walked in with was gone, replaced by something bitter and humiliating. Langston straightened his suit jacket. "This case should have never made it to trial," he said simply. "And deep down, Mr. Whitaker, you know it." Judge Pembroke finally spoke. "Mr. Whitaker, do you have anything else to present to this court?" Whitaker opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Judge Pembroke turned to Langston. "Mr. Attorney General, you may take your seat." Langston nodded, stepping back. Whitaker's career-defining moment had just turned into his career-ending disaster, and the whole courtroom knew it. The courtroom was tense, hanging on the precipice of what everyone knew was coming. Whitaker swallowed, his mind racing for a way out. Any way out. But there was nothing. No argument, no angle, no clever wordplay that could undo the damage. Judge Pembroke let the silence linger before finally speaking. "Given the circumstances surrounding this case, I find it troubling that we are even here today." She turned her sharp gaze toward Whitaker. "Mr. Whitaker, in light of the testimony and evidence presented, do you truly wish to continue prosecuting this case?" A flicker of panic crossed Whitaker's face. If he said yes, he'd be knowingly pushing a losing case against the state attorney general, a man who now had public sympathy, legal authority, and the courtroom on his side. If he said no, he'd be admitting defeat. He glanced at Langston, who simply folded his hands, waiting. Calm, unbothered, in control. The choice was clear. Whitaker exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his podium like it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. "The state." He hesitated, his voice cracking slightly. Then, finally, he muttered, "moves to dismiss all charges." A wave of reaction surged through the courtroom. Gasps, murmurs, even a few quiet claps from the gallery. Whitaker felt the humiliation settle into his bones. Judge Pembroke nodded curtly. "Motion granted. Case dismissed." She struck her gavel. It was over. Whitaker stood there, frozen, as Langston rose from his seat. But instead of gloating or smirking, the Attorney General simply adjusted his cuffs and turned to leave. That stung the most. Because in that moment, Whitaker realized that to Langston, this wasn't a victory worth celebrating. It was just another reminder of a broken system. And for the first time, Whitaker felt the weight of that truth. Later that evening, Whitaker sat in his office, blinds drawn, the dim glow of his desk lamp the only light in the room. His hands were clasped together, elbows resting on his desk. His career wasn't over, but after today, his reputation was shattered. A soft knock at the door. He didn't look up. "Come in." His boss, District Attorney Richard Coleman, stepped inside. A man with decades of experience, Coleman had a reputation for being calculating, never showing emotion unless it served a purpose. He shut the door behind him, studying Whitaker for a long moment before speaking. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Whitaker swallowed hard. "Sir, You humiliated this office." Coleman cut him off, his tone eerily calm. "You walked into that courtroom completely unprepared, picked a fight with a man who outranks you and turned a simple case into a national headline." Whitaker flinched. "National?" Coleman tossed a folded newspaper onto the desk. Whitaker slowly unfolded it. "Georgia Attorney General wrongfully detained, embarrasses prosecutor in court." Whitaker closed his eyes. Coleman sighed. "Pack your things." Whitaker's stomach dropped. "Sir, please, you're done here," Coleman said, turning for the door. "Effective immediately." As the door clicked shut behind him, Whitaker let out a shuddering breath. He had walked into that courtroom expecting to humiliate someone. Instead, he had humiliated himself, and the whole world had watched it happen. Justice isn't just about the law. It's about who holds the power. The system failed when it assumed guilt before facts. But Langston didn't win by yelling or fighting. He won by standing his ground with intelligence and truth. This story is a reminder that no title, no degree, and no amount of experience can protect you from bias. But knowledge, that's your greatest weapon. Stay informed, stand firm, and never let injustice go unchecked, because sometimes the most powerful move you can make is simply not backing down. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notification to be the first to know when interesting and lesson-packed stories like this one drop.